Hello, welcome to Conway Video. In this video, I'd like to talk about the idea of anti-fragility and how that connects to error handling and exception handling in code and also defensive coding, and why I think exception handling and even defensive coding may not be such a good idea because of basically the learnings that we can get from the concept of anti-fragility. So let's get into it. So some of you may have read a book by I think it's Nicholas Taleb. He wrote a few books. One is Anti-Fragile, and other is The Black Swan. But he has this idea of anti-fragility that has become quite kind of mainstream, I'd say, or well known. And so it's a good concept to begin with, and to think about. And I think one of the ideas that he offers with anti-fragility is this. He's saying that a thing is anti-fragile if the more stresses you apply to it, the more stresses and strains you give it, the more challenges you give it, the better it gets. So, whereas we're used to thinking about if you stress or strain something, then that's going to wear it out and break it. Like, say you have a bag and you keep knocking the bag around and throwing it on the floor and throwing it here and there, then it's going to gradually get worn down and scratched and tattered, and eventually it won't work anymore as a bag, right? It'll have holes in it or whatever. But the idea of anti-fragility is actually quite the opposite. It's the idea that the more pressures you put on something, the more you throw at it, the more stress and strain and stuff, the better it actually gets. Because every time you stress it, every time you find a vulnerability in it, then it heals, it self-repairs, it improves itself, and then the next time something similar comes at it, it knows how to handle that, and it doesn't have a problem with it anymore. So now it's actually stronger because the next time something hits it, it's able to deal with that. And I think this idea is is particularly true with regard to software. But before I tell you why, I want to talk about error handling and exception handling. So in a lot of code bases that I've looked at in my career to date, I've seen developers get really fixated on exception handling. And it can get really bad to the point that they put an exception handling block into every function or into every controller or action in an MVC style application, or into every component in a component type of application. And there's basically all these try-catch blocks everywhere. And there's problems with that. And one of the big problems is that the errors aren't really handled correctly, because when you do so many try catches, obviously you don't have any time to actually put anything meaningful into the catch. And so what ends up happening is the error just gets logged to some log file in some database somewhere that no one ever looks at. Or maybe people do look at it, but then there's so many exceptions and errors that it just gets overwhelming and no one has time to go through and sift through and fix them all. So in the end of the day, all these errors that happen just get unhandled and the software just breaks, but no one really knows that it's breaking. And so in that case, the software has become quite fragile because, or should I say, it's got a lot of defects and faults and flaws, but it's not getting better because of those. Now, I guess the alternative to all this exception handling, and I'd say this is the same principle, by the way, with defensive code. So, people putting lots of if statements at the top of a function to say, oh, well, if we want to consider it an error if this string is longer than this many characters, say longer than 30 characters, or if this value is outside of the range of acceptable values, then we want to raise an error, and so on. I think it's a similar principle. It's basically you're writing code to try to look for errors and then fix them and prevent them from happening. And then I guess the problem with all this is that because the developers never get to see what the errors are that are generated, the developers never really have an opportunity to improve the system in such a way that those errors just don't happen again. So instead, we've got all this code that's busily trying to stop any errors from being raised or being surfaced and just to keep the application running. But because of that, code we're actually kind of insulating ourselves as developers from the problems that are really happening in real life. Users are clicking this and typing that, and something's going wrong, something's breaking, and we don't know about it because it's all just going into a log file somewhere, or it's being handled away somewhere. And a nice, attractive, beautiful error message is shown to the user. But the user, of course, is like, why is this not working? So it's not a good state of affairs, and it's the opposite of anti-fragile. So what if we were to make this system that we're talking about more anti-fragile? So in fact, what we might want to do is expose the errors. We might want to still log them, but then we might want to be checking the logs. Or we might want to just not worry about handling the exceptions, just make the thing go live, let it break, let it fail, let something go wrong, and then we'll come back and fix that thing that went wrong when we find out, and we will find out about it. I mean, if something breaks, people are going to be contacting support, or hopefully there will be some logging, or someone will be testing it, or us as developers should really be doing the testing, so we should catch it as well. And then by doing that, by not trying to handle everything away, but actually like letting things fail and then finding out where they fail and then fixing those failures, we over time eventually end up building much better systems. They're systems that are set up in such a way that they can't fail. So for example, if the user is allowed to input only up to a certain number of characters, then we put that limit right into the user interface so that the user literally can't stuff up. They can't give an input that's going to fail and break the whole system. Or we go the other way and we say, oh, okay, let's just be liberal and let them enter as many characters as they want. And then our system is now supporting all the level of inputs that it needs to support, and there's no need for an error. So you can see that whichever way you slice and dice it, at the end of the day, this is about preventing errors from happening in the first place. And the way that you do that, counterintuitively, is by letting the errors happen, letting them be cause exceptions, and letting the whole thing blow up. Because then we're going to find out why it blew up, how and why it blew up, and we're going to change it so that it doesn't blow up in the first place. And I would say that 9 times out of 10, you don't need any exception handling if you build your software this way. If you build your software in such a way that there isn't an error, that the inputs it's going to get are going to be the right inputs, and that that there isn't anywhere in the system that's going to give it those bad inputs in the first place. And maybe you have a few checks here and there, but generally, if you build your system that way, then it's not going to fail in the first place. So there's no need for a try-catch block. There's no need for exception handling in the first place. It's kind of like the errors have been designed out of the system. So the system no longer supports any error states because there aren't any error states to begin with. I would say that's the best kind of system. As a user, I would want a system like that. When I go and upload a video to YouTube, or I go write something in my word processor or something, I don't expect there to be errors. I expect it to just work. And if there's an input that I could give the system that would cause an error, I would expect the system to not let me give that input. Just don't give me a way to shoot myself in the foot. Don't give me a way to break the system. Just prevent me from breaking it, and only give me the options that I should be allowed to have. And so there's a place for exception handling. There's a place for defensive coding, definitely. There are times when you're dealing with external systems and they are unpredictable, or they are going to give you inputs that are incompatible with your software or your frameworks. And then you're going to need to do some sort of conversion and translation. And I'd say even there, that conversion or translation layer, that's where you should be doing those sorts of checks and those sorts of amendments. And then you should be very clear about what it is that you're checking and what it is you're amending and what your expectations are. And then, but then, you're not hiding exceptions, you're not hiding errors, you're just putting them in the right strategic locations so that you can deal with those unpredictable inputs or unpredictable systems. But I would say most of the time, exception handling is almost a red flag. It's almost a sign that there's some problem that needs to be addressed, and maybe it would be better to actually take out the exception handling, let it fail, find out where and how it failed, and then change the system so that it doesn't fail and it can't fail in that way anymore. And so yeah, I hope that in the future, us developers will evolve beyond needing to put in exception handling and defensive coding and all these checks, and just build systems piece by piece, incrementally, and let the errors come at us, because The errors that don't kill you are going to make you stronger, right? The errors that every time you get an exception or an error, or someone complains about the system not doing something right, that's an opportunity to improve the system, to learn and improve the system, make it better. And that's how you're going to build an anti-fragile system. That's how you're going to build a system that ultimately is so well designed to deal with these problems that they're not problems anymore. It just kind of gracefully keeps doing what it's doing and satisfying the users. So yeah, thanks for watching.